Creation, Book of Portals, Chapter 8. She soon found herself in training to learn how to construct a wristband. Unlike before, when she was in intensive study to be an astronaut, or even when she was initially learning to work in the Narlean tech labs, this seemed easy in comparison. She didn't want to come off as if she knew everything, but it almost felt natural, intuitive, learning the ins and outs of the portal technology. She started by using the chrysanthemum, her torch invention, to collect light from the Great Luminary. She already knew the Great Luminary powered essentially everything, but she still found her mind drifting back to Hito and wondering what the creature could have been trying to communicate to her. She tried to minimize those thoughts, especially when she wasn't alone. She wasn't sure how far their reach was when it came to knowing her thoughts, so she made sure to stay intentional about her thought process regardless of who she was around. She was taught how to manipulate the light of the luminary to create the band. The Narlips gave her special edition gloves designed to withstand the heat of the light as she formed the orb into a thin, elongated shape. The gloves were long and thin, at least 3 times the size of a human glove. She wore the oversized gloves, and with a heightened awareness, she carefully wrapped the orb of light in a carbon-like fabric called hexasin, which initially hardened in response to the high temperature of the light, before becoming supple yet firm to the touch once fully sealed. Once the light was securely in the material, the band felt flexible and sturdy. She noticed that unlike the model she had used the day before, the inside of the most recent band had needles that connected into the skin of the Narlips when attached. So when she tried one on to test its functionality, she braced for the pain of being pierced. But she didn't feel anything. Though in comparison to her astronaut duties, this was easy. Assembling a band consisted of meticulous work. She poured hours into rewiring and restructuring the band, making sure every function of it, from screen projection to calling to portal creation, was intact. In the end, she had learned to construct a Portalese wristband that was identical to Kaitos' version. This was only the second stage of her mission, though. Her next stage was to supersede it, which was where the task became difficult. She already made some durability improvements, one of which included her constructing an aeronite mesh to line the outside of the hexasin wrap of the band. Aeronite was a metallic substance found on Narleo that was both flexible and strong, even if dated. Older models of the band used aeronite only before switching to a more durable hexasin, but none had used them in combination with each other. So she melded the materials together to create a seamless functionality and look. The smooth metallic purple of the hexasin was accented by the mesh-like copper of the aeronite. She hoped the addition of the aeronite would serve to keep the band intact in case of another attack. She wouldn't know for sure until it was time for her testing trial, though, which wouldn't happen until the first version of her band was complete. After finding ways to strengthen it, though, she soon felt she had nothing extra to offer. Kaitos had been right. The creature's version of the Portalese was quite literally the perfect invention. It did everything anyone would need: communication, image projection, temperature regulation, portal creation. Wait, it did do everything. That's true, but it had one weakness. It ran on the energy supplied by the Great Luminary. She thought back to her time spent in Narleo. It was exactly the oasis it was described as, and at the center of it all, a giant orb illuminated the entire planet. The light was constantly being pulled from, used to illuminate and power objects all over the planet. She found herself thinking, what if one day the Great Luminary stopped working? What if the light ever ran out? What would the Narlips do then? Since the Narlips prided themselves on not being wasteful, she found this was the perfect angle from which to approach her ideas of improvement. She finally knew what it was she could fix, but unfortunately, she didn't yet know how. She didn't dream very often, but when she did, her experience traveling through the vividly disorienting dreamscapes stuck with her. They were often precious reminders of her existence on Earth. After a day in the lab, she found herself in her bed, staring up at the ceiling. It had been a long day of testing out new energy sources for the wristband. At this point, she had been trusted with working on the band alone, but at the end of each session, the attending Narla would make sure to confiscate it. She was excited for the new freedom, as it meant her method had been working. They were trusting her. It was hard, keeping her thoughts maintained and focused to appease them, but she was happy to see the results. She found her only relief to be in her dreams, because as long as her waking thoughts were clear, her dreams couldn't be used as evidence of ill intent. Or at least, that's what she thought. Because the great luminary was so bright and it was centered in the middle of the planet, it never truly turned to nighttime in Narleo. But even still, her and the other humans found themselves adhering to a sleep schedule. This night, she found herself growing tired earlier than usual. On the nights where her most vivid dreams would occur, she noticed early exhaustion was usually an indicator. She didn't fight it. She lied down in the bed and allowed rest to take over her mind, her body, and her soul. She began dreaming almost immediately after she settled into sleep. In the dream world, she opened her eyes into a dark room. The black void was expansive, engulfing her on all sides. The air around her buzzed with electricity as if the room was alive, feeling her, sensing her. It reminded her of what it felt like when she was floating in space. She was so small against the boundlessness of the expanse, and she could do nothing about it. It was almost comforting knowing that she could do nothing, that once again things were completely out of her control. Then, a spark lit up the expanse, bright and blinding. It immediately drew her attention, and the gravity that existed in the black expanse physically pulled her to it like she was being magnetized. Floating in the middle of the great void was a familiar sight, a light orb from the great luminary. It was floating just in front of her, less than an arm's length away. As she stared, her chest ached a deep, piercing ache. Instinctively, she reached out to touch the orb. As she did, the light exploded in her hand, sending sparks in every direction. Some of the sparks that made contact with her burned her to the touch. For the first time, she realized the Anura wasn't covering her skin. She felt every bit of burning sensation from the sparks. In a way, she welcomed it. The light orb grew in size, continuing to spark in every direction. She stepped back, unable to take her eyes off the spectacle. The light orb began to form into a shape. Soon, as the sparks started to settle and the light began to dim, she was able to see that the shape turned into a figure. Suddenly, in front of her, stood her uncle, staring straight back at her in vivid detail. She stepped back quicker now, confused and frightened, but he ushered her forward, making gestures for her to approach. He looked so real, so present. She cautiously stepped forward, careful to watch his every move. She could see the emotions behind his eyes, the clarity. She could tell his mind was clearer than it had ever been as long as she knew him. As she came closer, he extended his hand out toward her. She reached out thinking he was trying to hold her hand, but instead, he put something in it. And as she looked to see what it was, he smiled at her and nodded. It was an iridescent rock about the size of her palm. And with that, her dream ended and it was time to wake up. She was conducting another feast with the other humans, and after the usual festivities, she found herself gazing at her plate. It was seafood night, a theme chosen by Amelia. It would be the first time Amelia would try fish, and the humans had decided to designate that day as her Narlean birthday. It had been fun, watching the child plow through the projected crab legs as if they were real, while the other humans piled a nearby table with hollow gifts like toys and dolls. They even used the food globe to make a hollow cake for Amelia, vanilla with a strawberry icing border. Smiles were shared all around, a successful feast yet again. She was becoming satisfied with it, with the closeness that the shared experience brought. Even though the humans were complacent, she found that their feast would give them a bit of excitement, something special to look forward to. And even though she couldn't fathom why, it was enough for them. And even with the celebrations, they still looked dismal and disconnected on the days they attended their testing. The fake meals were not enough to save them from that fate, but she couldn't allow herself to think about it, especially when she had such a strange and vivid dream she was keeping from entering her thought patterns by focusing on her food. Like everyone else, her plate had been filled with fish and various crustaceans. Seafood had been her favorite type of cuisine on Earth. She had taken a few bites of the catfish and eaten the claws on her lobster, but then she stopped. For a reason unbeknownst to her, looking at her plate suddenly made her remember the rotten animal carcass recipe she once found. It instantly made her stomach turn. However, she remembered something else also. The library had access to information from all over the universe, which also meant that they'd at least have tomes or blueprints of other universal technologies. She suddenly knew where to find the inspiration for a new power source. Excusing herself from the table in the festivities, a habit she taught the Narleans to follow, she hurried to the library. At the entrance, her body was scanned and a portal opened to allow her in. She knew the directory she was looking for would be located on the 9th floor, dedicated to the Technological Discoveries Department. After she had learned to open the portal and passing the unofficial test immediately afterward, she had been granted access to 2 of the higher floors of the building. She approached the Narlip and asked to be transported to the 9th floor. After scanning her body with the portalice to ensure clearance, the Narlip projected a portal, transferring her to the Technological Discoveries Department. Once there, she was amazed at the sight. The department had been much grander than she thought. It was easily 3 times the size of the food floor and was separated into several different sections. Her mind struggled to make sense of it. Judging from the outside of the building and even the first 7 floors, there should have been no way that the 9th floor was able to exist so high up based on its sheer size. Even still, holographic books, weaponry, technology models, and a multitude of hollow diagrams and blueprints stretched as far as the eye could see. Her eyes scanned the signs of the various sections, searching for one that would help her pursuits. While looking, she passed display cases containing gadgets gathered from across the universe. There were flight contraptions gathered from Gornal, a planet in the Syzyx galaxy. They looked much like the wings of pterodactyls, except that they glowed in neon green color. She was intrigued. She stepped closer to read a label on the display case. Powered by Radion. She quickly stepped away. She had read in the Narlean book about how Radion played a part in their last world's destruction. This is why the Narlips were so careful of a species now. With seemingly all technologies of the universe at their fingertips, they didn't use everything they discovered. They knew technology used carelessly led to the downfall of worlds, and being that they suffered the same fate in their fairly recent history, as a collective, they were not too keen on utilizing equipment that could bring about their imminent destruction. This was why they sought to learn, while discovering safe and effective ways to incorporate tech into their daily lives, or at least that's what Kaidos told her. She knew to keep this in mind when developing the new version of the Portalice. She passed cases filled with different technologies, and after reading the labels on the displays, it wasn't long before she realized that section of the floor was essentially a shrine to worlds that fell to their own destruction. That section, unlike much of the rest of the library, held the actual physical weapons instead of the holographic versions of them. One case contained mechanical ants that were designed to excrete a poison into the atmosphere. This was from planet Hole in the Valoon galaxy. The display explained that the ants' poison slowly melted away the flesh of the inhabitants that inhaled it. Unfortunately, there were too many ants and their kill switch malfunctioned. So with no way to disable all of them, once the intended job was done, they continued leaching the poison all over the planet. Another case held the makings of a bomb, disassembled of course. Its label stated that it was of beryllium origin, a planet made almost entirely of a fiberglass-like material. The bomb didn't work in the way it was intended. Instead of exploding, it also malfunctioned, emitting a high-pitched frequency that melted the planet until the fiberglass-like material was nothing but a thin, flat disk floating in space. Many of the inhabitants were burned into the flat planet's surface. Only 20% of the population survived. She wondered, when so many worlds caved to utter disaster, how did the Narlops come across the technology of the fallen civilizations? She felt an urge to dig for an answer, but she ignored it. She had already been derailed from her original purpose, so she refocused. After a bit of searching, she found the section containing the books and blueprints of various forms of technology across space. This section, unlike the last, was small. It held only a few shelves of holographic materials. But she felt relieved. Less options hopefully meant for a greater chance at success. She combed through the materials, searching for anything of use. She was looking for a power source, one that was hopefully self-sustainable. She spent the next few hours poring over the passages in the books. One planet, Surza, used water energy to power their city. This was a good enough idea, and it was even feasible as there were already functioning hydroponic systems on the planet. However, she felt as if it wouldn't be as easily manipulated as the light from the Great Luminary proved to be. Another planet, Hova, used telekinesis to power their planet. She briefly thought about the Anura that was currently covering her skin. Then she thought about how her first instinct was to rip it off. No, it wouldn't work. Then she found a book on Atlantis. She remembered this book was the first book recommended to her after she woke up on a spaceship all those months ago. It felt like decades now. She pulled the hollow book off the shelf and looked through it. The book detailed the rise and falls of the Atlantean civilization. The stories her uncle would tell her about Atlantis rang distantly in her ears. Looking through the book gave her chills. Earth was never really a human planet, she thought. We came last. She turned the page to the section on Atlantean technology. The section showed various diagrams of technological advancements the Atlanteans achieved. They had a vast transportation system, vehicles that could withstand both the weight of being hundreds of miles under the ocean's surface and the weightlessness of being leagues of kilometers in the air. They had an intricate communication systems and a penchant for developing highly effective weapons. There were pages that detailed how pyramid structures were even used for time travel. If that wasn't enough, they also had their own version of portal technologies that they developed. She turned the pages fervently, fascinated by the futuristic yet ancient civilization. Then she found it. What she had been looking for. Their power source. Atlantis was ran almost entirely by crystal technology. It felt as if an alarm rang in her head. The entirety of the Atlantean civilization was able to sustain itself from the power emitted from mere crystals. She thought back to the crystal craze that overtook the country. She didn't understand it then, but she was sure a believer now. Just because she discovered an alternative didn't mean she knew where to find the crystals that she needed. She read a passage. Crystals, when harnessed correctly, can energize an entire planet. While crystal technology only amounted to supporting 80% of the Atlanteans' power grid, crystal technology was the most advanced and lasting discovery of the civilization. Crystal energy in Atlantis did not need to be replenished and was available in great abundance. Atlantean crystals are formed from pressurized rock or volcanic eruptions, but experiments have shown that they could even be formed from the power of a high-energy blast, which Atlantean officials have tried to replicate on larger scales. She thought about the last part for a moment. They could even be formed from a high-energy blast. She thanked herself profusely. The book she requested when she first arrived, the book on Narleo, held the answer. Before Narleo was as it was now, the planet had been subjected to assured self-destruction, a high-energy blast that emanated from the core of the world, which effectively hollowed out majority of the planet. Surely if a blast was big enough to halfway hollow out a planet, it'd be strong enough to form crystals. As she closed the book, something in the corner caught her eye. Turning to look, she realized there was another display case, as if the universe were playing a trick on her. Inside the case was a singular crystal. She stared at it, and in her mind flashed an image from her dream. The image of her uncle handing her a rock. Except now, she realized, the rock wasn't just a rock. It was a crystal. Just like in the dream, it was brilliantly iridescent, and not much larger than her palm. She looked at the label on the display, Fragment of Atlantean crystal. In the case was the answer to her problem, a crystal that could be used as a power source. She had to test it out. If this succeeded in the way it did for Atlantis, the Narleans could excavate the caves to find their own source of crystals, and eventually, Narlea could run on their own power supply. She waved the floor's attending Narlip over. This one had shorter legs, so it waddled as it walked. As it made its way over, she started pointing at the case. "Do you think you can open this for me? I'm working on a project for the oracles and need to use it." The Narlip scanned her body for her credentials, and once satisfied, it flicked its wrist, creating a tiny opening in the clear case. It reached in to pull the crystal from the case and handed it over to her before waddling away. She squeezed the crystal in her hand before stashing it in a pocket. Excitement spread through her body, electrifying her. She couldn't keep this discovery to herself. She had to tell Kaitos. She knew Kaitos would still be in the technical center, probably looking over diagrams from another experiment. She approached the building, a portal opening for her to enter. The building was empty. It was almost time to end the day. She walked down a hallway, headed for the lab her and Kaitos usually worked in. Further in front of her, she saw K1 walk by. It didn't notice her. Weird, because it seemed she rarely saw K1 these days. It was even absent from their feast with Amelia earlier. She followed to catch up, intending to announce herself, before she saw K1 opening a door to a corridor down which she had never been. A door? She tried to remember the last time she saw or even used a door. It suddenly registered that she hadn't seen a physical door since she came to Narleo. With the popularity of portals on the planet, the mechanism seemed ancient to her now. As she saw the door slowly pull to a close, she quickly followed after K1, sure to silence her thoughts. She slipped into the opening before the door could close all the way. She suddenly found herself in a very dimly lit hallway. Just in front of her, she saw K1 pushing a bin and noticed it didn't have a wristband on. She felt a strong shiver down her spine, an eerie, uncomfortable feeling. Still, she followed, making sure to keep a distance away. She turned a corner after K1 hiding behind a pillar. She peered around it to see a plain white corridor with windows to rooms on each side of the hall. Each window had a corresponding door. K1 wheeled the bin to a door at the end, opening it. She heard the wheels of the bin squeak as K1 pushed it inside. Wait. She heard the bin squeak. She heard it. In the lifetime she had spent in Narleo, she had never heard a thing. Ever. Everything had been dictated to her straight into her mind, but she heard the squeak. How? She decided to move closer. As she did, she realized she could hear more sounds. What was it? Moaning? Groaning? Or was it crying? Yes. She was sure she had heard crying coming from some of the rooms. As she approached the first window, she peered inside. What she saw horrified her. It was a child, no older than 13, strapped to a table crying. Its eyes were splayed wide open, the hair on its head partially shaven, its arms bruised and covered with bandages. The child didn't have the same skin-like covering she was wearing. It wore a plain hospital gown. It was weeping, but no tears could come out. Standing above it was a Narlip brandishing surgical utensils. Another Narlip in the room, who had taken the form of E.T., approached the window, turning the clear glass mode off. Suddenly the glass was opaque, and she could no longer see what was happening. But she heard it. Her stomach turned. Suddenly a bright light started seeping from beneath the edge of the door. The sound behind the door abruptly stopped. Her body grew rigid with alertness, but she had to get answers. She moved forward, peering into other windows. In each, humans of varying ages and conditions were strapped to carbon slate tables, being prepared to be operated on. The glass turned opaque before she heard their torture begin. What was happening to them? In the next window, she saw the unimaginable. A man was lying on the table awake, with his stomach and chest sliced open, his organs displayed for the Narlips to study. 3 of them gathered around, poking and prodding, peering closely into the open cavity of the man's chest. She felt bile rise in her throat as a Narlip took a chrysanthemum light tube, the torch she had created, and switched it on. The Narlip pointed the end of the tube at the man's open body. The man made an animalistic scream. As he screamed, a bright light was pulled from the center of his chest. The light was so bright its rays illuminated the hallway. As the light was pulled from him, she felt a sharp pain in her chest. It reminded her of the emptiness she felt when gazing at the orbs of light, or the great luminary. She shut her eyes and covered her ears as the man's wails grew louder before abruptly quieting down. She looked again. The man's body lay still and grayed on the table. The Narlip switched off the absorption mode of the torch. There was a light orb hovering at the end of it, bright and lively, just like the orbs that were pulled from the great luminary. Feeling sick, she moved further down the hallway. Hito's gestures flashed through her mind. Hito had pointed at her, then her drawing, then the great luminary, its watch, and then back at her. Hito had tried to tell her. It was warning her, and it was left stranded because of it. Humans were being tortured to power Narleo. She didn't know. She didn't know humans were the real power source. She had to find an explanation for this. She had to find K1. There had to be a way to put a stop to it, but as she approached the room at the end, the room that K1 had entered, she realized it was far worse than she thought. In the last window, she saw a Narlip pulling a human skin suit over its body. The human body that it had came from was lying on the carven table, muscles, tendons, and veins exposed. It looked like a live anatomy model. Next to the body was another Narlip. It flicked its wrist, changing its form. Suddenly, it was no longer a Narlip. Instead, it had morphed into a spitting image of Amelia. A violent wave of nausea erupted in her as the realizations hit. It's impossible. There's no way. The other Narlip finished pulling on the human skin suit. The Narlip twisted its wrists, and suddenly all the cuts, bruises, scrapes, and blood began to disappear. The human skin suit started to morph its way onto the Narlip's body, perfectly stretching to fit the Narlip's new form. As the creature turned around, she locked eyes with the being, recognizing it instantly. She saw K1 smile beneath the human skin suit before her world went dark. Hello, this is Michaela Simone Mack, author and writer of Creation, Book of Portals. Thank you so much for tuning in to the second season. I'm very excited to share this story with you. As always, every episode is coming out on Friday, so please stay tuned for next week. I would be greatly appreciative if you continue to listen, and also if you left comments about what you think about the story, and also if you shared it with your friends. Thank you so much. Have a great day. I'll speak to you again next Friday. Bye-bye.